If you accept Mark in priority, and for the purposes of this course we will, there are key points that flow from that. So one thing we want to keep in mind is that even after Mark is written, the remembrance of that oral tradition remains. Now remember, we looked at the three layers of gospel tradition, and while it's true that the written version of the gospel, as we'll see in its dating, comes from the second or third generation of the Christian community, that's not to say that there could not be individuals who would have lived long enough to have remembered both the ministry of Jesus and experienced the proclamation of these written gospels. Furthermore, we want to keep in mind that, again, that oral tradition is still there alongside these gospels. For all the length of time it takes to produce them, it is a relatively brief period of time, and of course a brief period of time in which they're produced. So there's certainly the possibility that the people hearing these written gospels were also still familiar with other traditions. We also want to keep in mind that if Matthew and Luke have both used Mark, so taken material found in Mark and incorporated it in one way or another into their gospel accounts, then we can study that process, a process known as redaction or editing. We can take a look at the same passage in both Mark and Matthew and ask questions. Is there a difference in the language? Is there some alteration of the narrative that proposes or suggests Matthew's own theological perspective? We also want to keep in mind that other materials employed by Matthew or Luke, whether it be from the Q source or whether it be L material, M material, is not necessarily later than Mark. So the fact that we propose Mark as the earliest gospel is not an automatic assertion of its authority over the other two. They have their own sources other than Mark, and those sources might be more reliable. So the bottom line is that all three Gospels, as we'll see in our study of them, have a theological perspective, and it's not really possible to propose one as being more authoritative than any other. A thorny problem in contemporary scholarship is the existence of Q. So remember, Q is our hypothetical source suggested to explain the double tradition, material that's common to Matthew and Luke but not found in Mark. And again, we have the plausible assumption that Matthew did not have Luke and vice versa. So the Q material that's found in the two Gospels is estimated at somewhere between 220 and 235 verses. Although we want to keep in mind that they may have omitted some of Q, because when they use Mark, they don't include all of Mark. So it's certainly possible that the so-called Q material belongs to a larger body of material, although we don't know whether that material is written or oral, and again, we don't know the extent of it. We then have yet another confusing possibility, and that's that some of the material we currently label as M or L, special Matthean material or special Lucan material, might also be Q material that has not been used by the author. So it could be that Luke uses more of Q or Matthew uses more of Q. The other doesn't perhaps use that passage, and so we don't realize that it comes from Q. Generally, contemporary attempts to reconstruct the Book of Q, so-called Book of Q, follow the Lucan order, but even that's not certain. The presumption is the Lucan use of Q is more raw, more primitive, and closer to the original. But again, we can't say that for certain because we do not possess any copies of Q, and we don't know even that Q is one document or one tradition. It could be, in fact, a combination of traditions. Although most would hold that if there is a Q, it was composed in Greek. And some suggest that some of the differences between the Lucan and Matthean usage of Q material could be explained by the existence of more than one version. So there could be versions with differences among them, and each gospel is dependent on a different version. The Q material consists largely in sayings and in some parables. It doesn't have much in the way of narrative, so it doesn't really set this in a story. It's a collection of sayings of Jesus. in those sayings we see a strong eschatological thrust. So they're interested in the end times. They're interested in the return of the Lord, the ultimate intervention of God. Some read the Q material and propose what systematic theologians would call a low Christology. Remember, high Christology is a descending Christology, the assertion of Jesus's, or an emphasis on the assertion of Jesus's divinity, as opposed to a low Christology, which is an emphasis on Jesus's humanity. Although these terms don't fit very well in the scriptural setting, since each of the Gospels have materials that would be both low and high. So it's kind of hard to suggest. I would prefer in this course that we use language like an exalted Christology rather than the language of high Christology. There are also very highly debatable attempts to reconstruct a community for Q. One of the things we'll be doing when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke is trying to ask questions about what kind of audience or community that these particular theological witnesses may be addressing. And we can certainly have some speculation about that. But in the case of Q, it gets much more difficult for the reasons that we've already seen. We don't possess a manuscript of Q. We don't know if we have Q itself, or whether we have documents or traditions that come from a variety of sources. We don't know if we possess the entirety of it or just parts of it. But we do see in the Q material the suggestion of persecution. So that suggests that the Q material is no or not much older than the Markan material, which also comes from a time of persecution, and from all that we can tell, pretty much the earliest period of persecution in the early Christian experience. So that puts Q more or less contemporary with Mark. Very important to remember when it comes to the question of Q is that there is no Q. I don't mean to say that it absolutely does not exist, but rather we do not possess any copies of Q. We have the hint of Q in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, but we do not possess Q. A very important caution against too much speculation when it comes to the theology of Q or the community of Q, although you will find books written on these matters, and you'll even find books that claim to be annotated versions of Q. But remember, there is no Q. If you take a look now at this chart, this is taken from Wikipedia, you'll see that the two-source hypothesis, the original suggestion of the relationship among the Synoptic Gospels, is illustrated here. So you see the two sources at the top, Mark on your left, Q on your right, both of which are sources for Matthew and both of which are sources for Luke. While this theory, the two-source hypothesis, is very helpful for us in understanding the relationship among the Synoptic Gospels, the next chart is a little bit more detailed and helps explain the wider variety of relationships among them. You can find this chart posted on the wiki, and I would ask you to take a look at it and study it, because again here we have the complications in a sense of the relationship among these three Gospels. But at the center you see the purple material represents what we call in the beginning triple tradition. So in the theory of Markan priority, the idea would be that a good part of Mark has been used independently by Matthew and Luke in the compositions of their Gospels. But notice that that's less than half in the case of each of those two Gospels. So there's other relationships that have to be accounted for. We have a very small body of material shown there in brown, which will be unique to Mark. So this is material that has not been used by Matthew, not been used by Luke. We then have a body of material shown in red, which is common to both Mark and Luke. So passages in Mark that Matthew has not used, but Luke has made use of. And we have a very small amount of material in gray that Matthew has used from Mark and Luke has not. But then notice that we have material that's listed as unique to Matthew, that's that M material, and material that would be unique to Luke, or Lucan material. So special Matthean material, special Lucan material. These parts of these two Gospels are very significant because, being unique to each, they often deal with issues that are very close to the theological heart of the Gospel. So we'll be paying particular attention to those passages. So for example, in the case of Luke, it's here that we find some of those very beautiful Lucan parables, like the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Son. Lengthy parables, memorable parables, but unique to Luke and containing many of the strong theological themes or ideas that appear to be very important to Luke and his community. In the dark blue, you see that about a quarter of Matthew and a quarter of Luke are the double tradition. So this is where we'd find our Q material. So Q is proposed as a solution to that double material, that second source. So again, please take a look at this chart and try to remember these relationships among the Gospels. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in class.